Okay, in this first lesson we're going to begin the process of adding particle effects to our scene. So here we have the scene file that has been modeled, textured, rigged, and now animated. So what we're going to be doing for the next several lessons is work on adding some particles to really kind of finish out this whole sequence before we start to get into lighting and rendering. So what we want to do is at this point where this vehicle sort of separates from its refueling hose here and then starts to take off in the air, what we want to do is start to create some particles to kind of create sort of a steam effect, like we may be fueling this ship up with some kind of liquid hydrogen or liquid oxygen that's sort of going to come out in kind of a really steamy look. So we're going to create this with just some really simple particle effects. So we're going to be working on this over the next several lessons. So the first thing I'm going to do is just middle click and go to a different camera over here. So this is my perspective view. There we are. We'll get in here a little bit closer. So to create our emitter, we're going to go up here to the Simulate menu, and we're going to go down to Particles. Now inside of Cinema 4D, we have two different particle types. We have particles, and then we have thinking particles. Now thinking particles are a little bit more advanced and require quite a bit of extra work to get looking right. So just to keep things simple, we're going to use just the standard particles. And you'll find that even though these are a simpler version than the thinking particles, these particles can still look really good. So let's start by creating our emitter. So here's our emitter right down here. Relatively simple. Now if I rewind back to the timeline and start to play back, you can see we do have a few particles that are coming out of this emitter here. Now these particles will really sort of act as the steam that's going to be coming out of the hose. And then we'll also have another emitter that is sort of kind of leaving more of a steam trail along the back of this vehicle, sort of out of this refueling port here. So let's start by taking this emitter and let's try to get this set up in sort of the right position. So let's pull this up. Now, right now this emitter is a little bit on the large side, so let's go into the coordinates. Let's take the scale for this and let's bring this down a bit. Let's say maybe 0.5. That's a little bit better. Looks like it may still be a little too large, so let's try bringing that maybe down to something like 0.3. There we go, that's a little bit better. Now let's come in here and once again sort of play this back. Okay, so we have this particle emitter in place. Now what we really need for this to do is to stick onto the hose itself. So let's come in and first take this emitter, sort of rotate this to where it's sort of pointing along the same direction as this hose. There you go, sort of pull this up here. Very good. Now with that in place, if we want this little emitter to be connected to the hose, it's really just a simple matter of parenting it. So let's come in and find our refueling line here. There we go. So let's take this one. This is going to be under our group. Let's take the emitter and basically just parent it underneath. All right, let's let this play through. All right, so there we go. You can see now that when the hose separates, it's actually going to take this emitter with it. Now again, we might want to come in here and do a little bit better job of aligning that. So maybe just pulling that up and just sort of getting that a little bit better positioned. Okay, very nice. So that is really the basic process of kind of making it look like now as this hose kind of separates, it should start to leave a little bit more of this steam trail behind it. Now in the next lesson, we'll start to focus a little bit more on actually getting these particles to look like steam. But for now, let's grab this emitter, let's go back to its particles, and let's start by just increasing the number of particles that we have here. You can see this is moving really quickly, and we only get a few particles here. So the first step in starting to really bump up the number of particles is we go to the emitter, go to the particle tab, and let's go to the birth rate. Now there's two different types of birth rates. There's the birth rate of the particles that we see in the editor, and then there's the birth rate of particles that we see in the renderer. Usually I like these both to be the same. So as we take this up to maybe 200, there we go. Play that back. Give this just a second to catch up with the timeline. There we go. That definitely gives us a few more particles to work with here. Let's maybe actually take our timeline, and I'll set the beginning to frame 100, so that way we don't have to play through quite so many frames until we get to the point where the hose separates. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better. Now in this case we maybe even want a few more particles. So we could take this up to something even higher, maybe like 2000. There we go. Now we get a pretty good little stream of particles in here. Now the last thing I want to do before we wrap up with this lesson is to control our beginning and end of our emission. What's actually happening right now, it's a little bit difficult to see, but as we start to play this back, if you look closely, there's actually particles that are being emitted pretty much from the second we begin playing through our timeline. So we have this big group of particles that are being emitted in here. So let's instead tell Cinema 4D to only emit particles at a certain point in time. So let's play through here. We'll find the point at which these hose starts to separate from the body. So in this case, looks like about frame 117, 118. So for the start emission, right now it's set to frame 0, which means the second we start to play back, particles start to appear. Let's now set our start emission to frame 118. And now what we should see is when we start to play back, there we go, the particles don't actually start to emit until we hit frame 118. Now in my case, I probably don't need these particles to keep going, because once this hose starts to separate from the body of the aircraft, our particles are probably going to stop emitting. So let's say for the end, we'll maybe set that at maybe something like frame 122. Alright, so that only gives us a few frames worth of particles. We probably want to bump this up a little bit more. Let's try maybe a little bit closer to 145 or 150. There we go. Okay, so now we have at least some basic particle emission that's going on here. Obviously still a lot of work left to do. So in our next lesson, we'll continue this process of working with these particles and starting to actually animate some of these different attributes.